Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. It's great to be back, and in today's video, we're going to be building this collapsible accordion using React.js. This video will cover a step-by-step process of how to actually achieve this. So if you're a complete beginner to React.js, don't worry, because I'm going to be covering everything from the start all the way to the end. So without further ado, let's jump straight into the video. So before we jump into the tutorial, there's a little bit of housekeeping I should mention. The first thing is I do have a link in the description which will take you to my website, and on my website you can find the GitHub repository for this tutorial. So if you're struggling to work on it, don't worry, that link will guide you through as a reference if you need, and will provide everything that I create in this video, so you can use it whenever you need. So highly recommend checking it out if you do get lost. Secondly, I do have another link in the description which will show you how to create your first React app like I have here. And once you've done that and you have your first create React app working, we can now jump straight into the tutorial. So first things first, you'll notice that we have a source folder here. What you want to do is within the source folder, we want to create a new folder called styles, which is where we're going to be creating all our styles for each component. And then we also need another folder called our components. Cool. So once you have these two folders, the next step is to actually go into your public folder here and go into the index.html file. I'm just going to quickly close this. What you want to do is come over to Google Fonts and type in Roboto. And what you want to do is to select font sizes 300 and 500. The reason for this is because this is the font that we'll be using for this video. And in order for this to work, what you want to do is to just copy this link here, go underneath one of the meta tags, this one here, paste that. So once you've pasted that in, the next step is to go back into our app.js file. So we'll get out of the index file. And another thing we want to do as well is we want to rename this to app.jsx. And once you've done that, we can start to create new files. So underneath the styles folder, we want to create two different files. The first one will be called app.css. This is the file we'll use to manipulate all the content outside of the component area here. The second one you want to put in is accordion.css. The purpose of accordion CSS is so we can manipulate this component here. And another thing we want to do is to open up the components folder. And within components, there's two different sets of components we need to create. The first one is accordion item.jsx. Accordion item will be focusing on, so if I close this, we'll be focusing on each individual accordion item like so. So we have one there, and one there. The other one we want to add in is our accordion menu. So just put in accordion menu.jsx. And the accordion menu outside of our accordion items is this huge container here, which will be working with the accordion menu. So once you have all your folders created, your styles are sorted, and your components are looking good, we can now start to build out this application. Let's get back into our app.jsx file. And the first thing we want to do is to remove everything within here and save it. So now it should look like a blank screen like what is being shown here. Underneath here, we want to get rid of the logo since we don't have a logo present anymore. And what we want to do now is underneath here, we want to import our accordion menu component that we just added in. So we'll do that now, accordion menu from our components, and we called it accordion menu. Once you've done that, another thing that we need to add in is our style component. So we want to import our styles and app.css file. Once you've done that, and once everything's looking good, the next thing you want to do is within the app div, we want to place in our accordion menu component. So what we can do now is just type that in like so and save it. There we go. It's working the way we want it to. Fantastic. And that's literally all you need to do for the app.jsx file. Really simple. Nothing too complicated. What we can do now is we can go back into our app.css file, which is this one here, and we can start to manipulate some of the styling components here. Again, we want to create this background here. So in order to do that, we want to target the body and we want to set a margin of 0, a padding of 0. We also want to display flex, so everything is aligned in the center. We want to set the flex direction to column, so everything goes from top to bottom. We also want to align everything to centered, justify content to center as well, so everything's nice and tight in the center. And we also want to set the height to 100 vertical height, so it spans from the top and bottom of the container. And that's basically it. I mean, you can add in a background color if you want, like a light blue, but for the purpose of this tutorial, I'm just going to keep it as a white background, like so. And then another thing we want to add in is our font family, and that was Roboto, which we stored from Google Fonts, which I showed earlier in the video. And once you've done that, we can now start to play with our accordion menu component. So what we'll do now is we'll close app.css since we don't need it anymore. And now we'll be working with the accordion menu, which is this part in the center. So what we're going to do is to open up the accordion menu. And what we can do now is underneath here, type in React arrow function component export. And what this does is it sets up the template for that React component, and it just makes our lives a lot easier. A little shortcut for those that didn't know about it. So underneath this line here, we want to type in import accordion item from the accordion item. The reason for this is because we want to grab our accordion item component, which is located here. Obviously, there's nothing in it, but we'll start to manipulate that down the track. So I'll just quickly close this up. And what we want to do now is, after doing that, we also want to import our styles component. So underneath styles, we want to target our accordion.css file that we created earlier on. Awesome. So once we've done that, we can start to play around with this part of the component. So in order to do that, what we can do now is we can go into our Figma file and we can start to see what we want to work with. So the first thing we want to do is to create an accordion menu parent div. So let's go back into the accordion menu. We want to call it the class name of accordion menu, like I did in the Figma file. And then the next thing we have is a H1 tag, which is this one, called title. So we'll target this. So let's call it h1.title. And for the sake of this video, I'm just going to use this and type it in there. So there we go. It's starting to appear the way that we wanted it to. What we're going to do now is, if we go back into our Figma file, you'll notice that we have a parent container called accordion items, which holds each individual accordion item component. So we'll do that now. Let's go back into here and we want to call it accordion items. And within accordion items, this is where we place our each individual accordion item component, which is up here. So I'm just going to grab that and I'm going to type it in there, save it. There we go. It's working the way we want it to. And just to make sure this is working, I'm going to go into our accordion item. And again, type in RAFCE, which means React Arrow Function Export Component. So it opens up this template, which is really neat. And I'm just going to keep accordion item in there. And there you go. You can see the accordion item is wrapped inside the accordion menu. Yeah, fantastic. So what we can do now after doing this is we can start to style the accordion menu component, which is this one here. So we'll be having a look at this and trying to manipulate how it looks in the Figma file. Awesome. So what we'll do now is I'm just going to close the accordion item since we don't need that. I'm going to open up my folders again and go back into our accordion.css file like so. Once we do that, we can now start to work with everything that we created here. So the first thing we want to target is the accordion menu. So let's do that right now. With the accordion menu, we want to make sure everything is centered. So we want to set a display of flex. We want to set the flex direction to column as well. We also want to ensure that the line items are sent to center. We also want to justify content to center. We also want to give it some padding. So you may notice in here, I'm just going to refresh this. There is no padding here at the moment. It's quite empty. So in order to fix that, we want to add some padding to the top. So if we go into here, it should say 50 to the top and bottom and 30 to the left and right. So let's add that in now. So 50 pixels for the top and bottom, 30 pixels for left and right. We'll save that. The next thing as well is our border radius. Let's set this to 15 pixels. Another thing we want to add in is a border so we can see where the container lives. Let's give it, I don't know, something like 1 pixel solid, and we want to set the color to the code hashtag BDBDBD, which should give it a nice light gray color. And once I've done that, we can start to see that this is starting to work the way we want it to, which is really cool. And once we've done that, we want to set a background color of white. And another thing that we want to add in is a box shadow. There's this really cool website that I found. I'll put a link in the description, and basically all it does is if you find a box shadow style that you like, all you do is you basically just click on it and it saves the code for you. So let's do, I don't know, number 6 in this instance. So click on it, go back into your code and paste it in here. And if we save this, you'll notice a bit of that drop shadow is added, which is really cool. Again, I'll provide the link in the description to this website, so don't worry, it'll be down there for anyone that wants to reference from it. Otherwise, you can copy the code here if that works as well. Awesome, so once you've done that, the next thing we want to do is with the width, we want to set it to auto. And there you go. Now everything is centered. We can now see where all the contents will lie. And we can also see the padding has been applied as well, so it has nice spacing to it. Fantastic. So after working with the accordion menu, the next thing we want to target is the actual title here. So let's go back into our title, and it was a H1. So let's target that now. With the H1 title, we want to set a display of flex. Again, justify content to center, align items to center as well, just to make sure everything is nice and centered. We want to give it a width, a fixed width of 600 pixels, just so if we were to rescale it, it doesn't disrupt the sizing. So we'll keep it at that for the sake of this video. For the color, I set a color with the code of hashtag 2F80ED, which should give it a nice blue color, which it does. That's looking really good. Another thing is we want to set a font size of 24 pixels and save that, which is looking good. We also want to give it a font weight of 500. So it is not too bold, but just enough so that it is seen as a H1 tag. And that's looking really good. So once we've done that, the next thing we want to do is to target the accordion items, which is the parent container of all of these individual accordion items. So let's do that now. I will grab that from here, save that, go underneath here for accordion items. Again, we want to set everything to flex. We want the flex direction to column, just so everything goes from top to bottom with the accordion items. And then we also want to set a padding of 20 pixels, just so there's nice spacing between all of them. We also want to align items to flex start, so it starts from left to right. And then we also want to give it a gap of 15 pixels, like so. And once you've done that, we have now finished the accordion menu styling. The next step we want to work on is the individual accordion item, which is located here. And this is probably one of the trickier parts, but don't worry, I'll run this through with you guys so you don't feel lost. So yeah, let's get straight into that now. So what we'll do now is go into our accordion item. Awesome. So with the accordion item, what we're going to be doing is targeting the active state, which is this one here. And then what we can do is once we have targeted the active state, we can turn items off and it should end up like the non-active state, which is shown in these items here. So we'll do that right now. So the first thing we're going to do is to target the accordion item, and we'll create a div from that. So if we go back into accordion item, we want to give it a class name of accordion item, and we want to set it to active since we're targeting the active state, which is this one here. After doing that, since that is the parent container where everything will be held, the next one we want to create is a icon container, and we'll save that. And we also want to give it an active state as well, since we're focusing on the active state, which is this. For those wondering what that is, it's actually just this icon here, which changes from a plus to a minus when it's open and closed. And within the icon container, we also want to have two separate divs, which are two different strokes. So the first one will be called stroke 1. And we also want to give that an active state, since that is the one that will be manipulated when it's on and off. And then the other one is stroke 2. But in this instance, since what we want to do is we just want to rotate the first stroke and overlap the one that is currently present, we won't need an active state for the second stroke. So it will only be the first stroke, and the second one we'll leave it as is. Let's save that. Another thing as well is we need to add in our contents. So our contents consist of a title, accordion title, as well as a p tag with our content inside of it. So let's add that in now. We'll go back to our accordion item. So underneath the icon container, we want to have an accordion title, which doesn't contain an active state. Since you'll notice in the on and off toggle, you'll notice that the title is always present, so we can leave that as is. However, you'll notice that the content here, the p tag, disappears when it's not on, so we want to give that an active state as well, since it will be changing. So we can do that now. So let's call it accordion content, and we want to give it an active state. And since these aren't divs, these are actual text, we want to change these to, let's give it a h1, and then this one here, we'll give it a p tag like so. We'll save that. And once you do that, the next thing we can do is to come back into our accordion title. I'm just going to copy these across, save that. We can now start to see that's beginning to appear, which is really cool. And then underneath here, I've just got some lorem ipsum for some content, and I'll add that in as well. Save that. And there you go. So we now have our h1, our p tag, and our icon container, which isn't present. But if I come over here, and we can see that the icon container exists just there. Cool. So once we've done that, the next thing we want to do is to start working with the styling, which will be really exciting. So let's do that right now. Go back into the original accordion.css file. So where we left off, which was the accordion item section. So the next thing we want to do is to target this frame here, which we're going to do right now. So if we go back into our accordion.css file, the first thing we want to do is to target each individual accordion item. And within here, we want to set a display of flex. We want the content to be in a column. So we'll do that. In this instance, we want to align items to flex start. We also want to set a width to 600 pixels, which is what we set earlier on up here. Once we also have done that, we want to set a padding for 20 pixels to the top, right, bottom, and left. We also want to give it a border radius of something like 15 pixels, just so the edges aren't too sharp. We also want to add in a padding of left with 72 pixels. Again, the background color, we want to set it to white because this is what the non-active state will be. So we'll keep it as white. And then finally, we also want to give it a transition of 0.25 seconds and targeting the background color like so. Awesome. So what you can see now is we have our non-active style state created. The next step is to work on the active state, which we added here in the class name. So let's do that now. So underneath accordion item, we want to create accordion item active. And literally all we need to do is change the background color to a different color than white. And in this instance, the color is set to hashtag F2F8FE. And that should give us a very nice light blue color. And if I save this, you'll notice that the blue now appears, which is looking really cool. And again, if I were to go back to accordion item and get rid of the active state, it should go back to white like it does. So it means it's working the way we want it to, which is really cool. Awesome. So once you've done that, the next thing we want to do and to target is the H1 tag. So if we go back into the Figma file, it's this one here, accordion title. So let's do that now. So let's go into our accordion title as a H1. So H1.accordion title. Underneath here, we want to set the color to black, which is just 000. Underneath there, we want to set the font size to something like, I don't know, 16 pixels. And then after doing that, we also want to give it a bold, but not too bold. So set it to 500. And that should reduce the size and look quite familiar and similar to how it looks in the Figma file, which it does. That's looking really cool. You may notice that in the Figma file, the non-active and active state both contain the title, so we don't need to manipulate an active state for this, so we can keep it as is without changing anything, which is really cool and makes our lives a lot easier. The next thing we want to target is the content. In this case, it does change. It appears and then doesn't appear when it's non-active, and that's represented by this P tag here. So let's work on that now. We called it accordion content, so let's grab that. P.accordion content. Underneath here, we want to set the max height for when it's not on to 0. We also want to set the overflow to hidden, just so you know it's not appearing. We also want to set the color to black. We want to set the font size to 12 pixels. We also want to set the font weight to something like 300. We also want to set the margin to 0. And we also want to give it a transition of 0.5 seconds, targeting the max height as well as the margin itself. Save that. So as you can see, the P content tag has completely disappeared. However, what we want to do, since we're targeting the active state to start off with, we want it to reappear. And again, you can see that the active state has been added in for this part of the video. So let's do that now. So what we're going to do is to copy this phrase here, give it active, and then within active, this is when we can start to manipulate the active state. So in this instance, we want to change the max height to something like, I don't know, 2 rem. And the margin as well, we want to give it 1 rem for the top and bottom and 0 for the left and right. And if I save this, it should reappear. There you go. That's looking really, really cool. And everything is nice and centered and it's all lined to the left, which is the way that we want it to look. And to make sure this is working, we can get rid of the active class name in our component. And if we save that, it should disappear. If we add it back in here, it should reappear, which means it's working. Awesome. So once you've done that, the final step is to manipulate these plus and minus signs when it's on and off. This part is probably the trickiest, but don't worry, I've sort of covered it in my spare time. So I'll be able to run it through with you and talk you through my thought process of actually So the next step is we want to manipulate the icon container here. So you'll notice there's one there, and then there's one here with an off and on state. So let's do that now. What we want to do is to first target the icon container as the off state. So let's do that now. We want to set the content to blank so we can start to manipulate and give it some form. We want to give it a position of absolute so we can move it around freely. We also want to give it a width of 12 pixels, which is the length of the container. We also want to give it a height of 12 pixels again, which is the height of the container. We also want to give it a Z index of 2. We also want to give it a border radius of something like 39 pixels, so it forms a circle. And then we also want to give it a transform, and we want to translate it so it's just to the left of the content here. So we want to translate the X direction by -3 rem, so it's being pushed back to the left. We also want to give it a translate Y, so it's being pushed up by 0.25 rem. Want to give it a padding of, I don't know, 0.5 rem, just a little bit. And then also we want to give it a transition targeting the background color of 0.5 seconds, as well as the box shadow of 0.5 seconds. So if we save that, and if we give it, I don't know, a background color of red, we can now see that circle appearing, and this is where our symbol, or icon rather, will be located, which is here. Awesome. I'm just going to get rid of the background color so we know it's there. So once you've done that, the next thing we want to do is we want to create the shadow, just so we can actually see that circle forming. So in order to do that, what we want to do is to target the icon container and its active state. And we want to give it a background color of white. So hopefully that starts to appear. Yeah, we can just see it. But in order to improve that, we want to give it some drop shadow. And again, go back to that website I showed you because it's really handy. And we'll give it number 6. So just click on that. And I'm going to paste it in here, save that. And now that circle is starting to appear. And that looks really, really cool. Awesome. The next thing we want to create are the actual stroke icons, which are these ones here. We're going to have 2. One is going to contain an active state and the other won't need to have that. And I'll show you that and why in a second. So with our first stroke and our second stroke, we want to give it a content of blank. We also want to give it a position of relative. So it's relative to the absolute position. We also want to give it a Z index of 1. And we also want to transition of 0.5 seconds all. If we save that, so what this is stroke 1 and stroke 2 contain these features. And now underneath, we want to change that by targeting each individual one. So with stroke 1, let's give it a width of 3 pixels. We also want to give it a height of 12 pixels. We also want to give it a background color of black. And we also want to translate the X direction by 12 pixels divided by 2, which is 6, minus 1.5 pixels. Let me add this as a calculation just so it works. And we also want to rotate this by 0 degrees. We'll save that. And there we go. We can now see the first stroke appearing. However, I want it to be rotated 90 degrees. So in order to do that, all we do is copy this, add our active state, and underneath here, what we can do now is we can copy this, paste it in here. Instead of 0 degrees, we can change it to 90 degrees, which is really cool. So just to make sure this is working, if we come back to stroke 1, if I remove the class name of active, and if I save that, you'll notice it goes back to the top and bottom approach. But if I change it to active, it rotates 90 degrees, making it left and right, which is really cool. Another thing which is really essential is to also manipulate the stroke 2 container. So what we can do now is we can literally just grab this, copy and paste it into here, change it to stroke 2, save that. And the only difference here that we need to make is change the translate X to translate Y. And we also, instead of 12 pixels, make it negative 12 pixels. And we can also get rid of the rotation as well. And we also want to change the height and width values around like so. And what should happen is that stroke should overlap with this one, which it does. And just to make sure this is working, what we can do now is go back to accordion item. And if we were to remove the active state, it should rotate back to its original value of 0 degrees, which it does. And if we add it back into here, you'll notice it goes to the negative symbol, which is shown here. Cool. So what we want to do is come back to accordion menu. And the cool thing about React is we can have a component and repeat it as many times as we want. And notice that they all appear within the accordion menu. The only issue is, what if a user wanted to change the title and content for each individual item rather than having the same content across each item? There is a way around this, and there is a method in React called props. Props basically act as arguments, and we can give it values for each individual component, which can be manipulated and changed. For example, in this instance, we want to change the title and content for each individual component. In order to do that, what we're going to do is inside of this component, next to accordion item, we want to give it a space and add in those two props. So the first one was called title. Let's just give it blank for now. And the second one was called content, and let's give it blank as well. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to delete these. And I'm just going to, again, copy these down, save those. So now we have 3. If we go back into our Figma file, I'm just going to use the first 3 for this example. So the first one is Introduction to React.js as the title. So we can place it in there. Save that. And then the content itself was just some lorem ipsum, which we can manipulate multiple times and paste it in there. I'll do the exact same thing here. And also, so we have 3 individual different titles. Paste that in there. And I'm also going to use this one as well. Cool. So what we have is we have 3 individual accordion items with each containing different titles. And in order to apply these props into our accordion item, what we want to do is go back to the accordion item. Within the parentheses of this item, we want to add in a curly bracket and put in our props. So our first one was title and our second one was content. We'll save that. What we can do now is we can literally get rid of this here, save that. You'll notice it goes blank. And we can also get rid of the content here. So now everything has been completely removed, and this is where the magic happens. So what we can do now is go back into our accordion title. You can place in the prop of title, save that, and you'll notice each component has a different title. This is because if we go back into here, remember we created the props and have different titles for each individual item. So for example, if I come into the first title and type in hello world, you'll notice that the first one is only impacted, and this is the power of using props. It's really cool because you can change the data in each individual component individually, which is really cool. And that's why I love using React. So yeah, that's pretty cool. And then if we go back into our accordion item, the second prop we added was content, but since they all use lorem ipsum, it should all be the same. Save that. And now all our content is present. This is really, really cool. So once we have our title and content props and we can manipulate them individually, The next step we want to do is to start to actually determine which items on the accordion menu component is active and which ones are not. And I'm going to show you that right now. So what we're going to do is we want to import React's Usestate hook. So what the Usestate will do is it will manage and track which ones are active and which ones are not. So in order to do that, and what we want to do is we want to create a const and we want to give it two conditionals. The first one is currently active. And the second one will be called set currently active as a function. And we want to equal that to Usestate. And for this tutorial, we're going to be using numbers. So let's set it to Usestate as a value of 1. The reason why we're using numbers is because the numbers will help us to determine which ones are active and which ones are not. If we go into our accordion menu, you'll notice there are 3 items here. Each item will represent a different number. So in this instant, number 1 will be represented by the first item, number 2 will be represented by the second item, and so forth. So what we're going to do now is we want to create a function which determines which ones will become active and which ones will not. And we'll be also manipulate the number here, which is represented over here by currently active. So in order to do that, we want to create a new const called handle accordion click. And with this function, we want to give it an arrow function. And as an argument, we want to set new active accordion. So if we were to click on a new active accordion, say for example, the current one is number 1, number 2 will become that value. So we want to keep that as a parentheses, as an argument rather, give it an arrow function, and within our curly brackets, we want to add the following. So what we want to do is we want to grab this function here. What this function will let us do is it will let us to manipulate currently active as a value. So within here as a parentheses, we want to create a conditional statement. If the new active accordion is the same as the currently active accordion, so if number 1 and number 1 are the same thing when I click on it, then I want this number here to not exist, which becomes the value of null. Otherwise, if they're different, let's say, for example, the first number, the current active accordion item is number 1, and the newly active accordion item that I click on is number 2. Since number 1 and number 2 is different, then I want the new value of currently active to become number 2, which means we want the new active accordion to be set right there. We'll save that. And once we have our Usestate value up here, which allows us to manage and track what the current active value is, and also our function with a conditional statement, which determines what items are active and which ones are not, then we can move into the next step. So the next step is to set 2 additional props to the title and contents for each accordion item. The first prop we want to add in is something called isActive. What this does is it determines what number is represented by each item here. So we can do that by saying currently active item is the same as number 1. What this means is the first item is represented by number 1 by using the Usestate hook of currently active. The second one we want to add in is an onClick function. And what we want to do is we want to create and take that handle accordion click function that we created. But before we do that, we want to create an arrow function since we're using an onClick value. And within handle accordion click, as our new active accordion, if we were to click on it, we want it to become number 1. So we'll put that in the parentheses. We'll save that. What we can do now is we can copy these 2 values, but instead of having number 1, since number 1 is represented by this item here, this is the second item, so we want to put in number 2, like so. We want to copy these values and do the same thing from item number 3. Fantastic. So once that is all done and you have your new props, the next step is to bring these values into each individual accordion item. Jump into accordion item, and what we want to do is we want to add in is active as well as on click as our on click function. So what we can do now is you'll notice that earlier in the video, for each class name, we have an active value here. What we want to do now is we want to remove this active value and replace it with a conditional statement so we can determine if this is active as true. So if number one is true, then we want this active to be added. Otherwise, if it's false, then we want it to be no longer active. So in order to do this and for this to work, we want to add in curly brackets. After doing that, we also want to replace the quotations with backticks like so. And then this is where we can add in our conditional statement. So add in a $sign, our curly brackets as well. And what we want to do is we want to put in the following. If is active is true. So if number one is true, then we want the value of active to be added. Otherwise, if it's false, we just want it to remain as blank. And you'll notice here the background, the blue background is removed for items 2 and 3. And if we go back into accordion menu, because number one is currently number one, and since that is true, under here, since those are represented by number one, it's true. It means that this value here is added in here. And say, for example, if I wanted to change this to number 3, you'll notice the blue background is added and these two are removed. That's because number 3 is represented by item number 3. And since is active is currently number 3, as you can see here, and that is true, the active value is added. And since number 1 and number 2 are not true, they are completely removed. So what we want to do now is I'm just going to come back here and set that to number 1. We can copy this conditional statement and apply it to all of our active class names that we played around with earlier on. Let's start by doing that now. So icon, container, save that. We'll copy this and add it to stroke 1. Just replace this with stroke 1. And you'll notice these symbols are starting to change, which means it's working. And then the final one, I believe, is the accordion content, which is this tag underneath here. Accordion content, save that. And now those values of active are removed relative to those outside of number 1, which are 2 and 3. Cool. So to make sure this is working, we can change this value from 1 to say 3 to 2, back to 1, and so forth. And that means it's working the way we want it to. One final thing we have to add in is our on-click prop. So this determines when we click on our parent container, in this case, the accordion item, we want this function here to fire, which is this one here. So what we can do now is we can add in our on-click function and replace it with our prop that we have here. So now if I go back into our creation, if I were to click on number 3 is created, number 2, number 1. If I want to close number 1, it closes, and so forth. If you're a little bit confused as to how this is working, but more so how this function works, I can demonstrate this by using a console log. So I'm going to do that right now. What I'll do is I'll add in a console log. And I'm going to give it some backticks and type in currently active item and determine that by currently active. So we know which item is currently active. And then we also want to add in a second one. This time, instead of currently active item, we want to add in newly active item and replace it with new active item. And then we also want to add in previous active item and put in the currently active item. So once we do that, we'll go back into here. I'm just going to refresh this. And let's say, for example, if I wanted to click on, I don't know, number 2, for example, you'll notice that the currently active item previously was number 1, but the newly active item is number 2. And since the previous active item is number 1, number 2 and number 1, are they the same? No. So this means that if, in this instance, if number 2 is the same as number 1, which is false, it skips over the value of null and replaces it with its new active accordion value, which is number 2. However, if I were to click on the same container, since number 2, the newly active item, and the previous active item are the same values, the new value for currently active becomes null, which cancels out number 1, number 2, and number 3, and therefore no item is activated since null has been created. Let's say I click on number 1. Is number 1 the same as null? That is false, and therefore the new active accordion value is activated. In this instance, it's number 1, and therefore this function fires and this is replaced with number 1. So yeah, that's basically the end of the video and sort of a background of how this component works. If you did enjoy the video, let me know in the comments below. If you're struggling with anything, again, I'd be more than happy to help. Just send me a message in the comments below. Another thing I wanted to also mention is a huge thank you to all those who have subscribed to my channel. I have just recently managed to reach the milestone of reaching 1,000 subscribers, which is a huge milestone, and it's been quite interesting to see, considering I also work a full-time job and sort of just do this for fun. But yeah, it really does help me out a lot down the track, especially if you want me to start producing more content. The more support you give me, the more content I can produce. It really does mean a lot to me. And again, thank you so much for all the support. And again, I will see you all in my next video. See you later.